Our first speaker this afternoon has had a huge influence on education in California. Mary Perry is an independent education consultant who helps education leaders make sense of the system, especially when it comes to the role of money. All kinds of people rely on Mary's advice because, along with the fact that she's able to understand the system incredibly deeply, she is also good at explaining it, which, quite frankly, a lot of people aren't able to do. And that's what we've asked Mary to do today. But Mary, will you help set us up to learn today?
I will certainly try. It's so important to understand the big picture of the system in order to figure out where you fit in and what you want to influence. So Ed100 really is a wonderful opportunity for you to think about and learn about the system and how it works. And I'm really excited to be part of that. So I'm going to go through the basics of it. As Zaid said, write down your questions. This is a really fast overview of something that takes a long time sometimes to learn about. Me personally, I am currently part of the California State PTA Board of Managers, which means I get to be involved in how the PTA does its work at the state level and try to keep track of what's happening at the state and how it's affecting your schools. So that's how that works. Today, we're going to talk about really four things, four big questions that I hope we can explore a bit. First of all, what makes public school public? And how are schools funded? How do schools spend the money that they get? Why do they choose to spend it that way? And are they doing a good job? So those are the fundamental questions that we'll go through. And one of the things I want to do is to remind you again to take notes. And I have liberally sprinkled that orange pencil all through this presentation. And I'll remind you about it as we go. So, first big question, what makes a public school public? Well, it's actually really simple. It's where the money pay for our public school system. In fact, California's Constitution requires the maintenance of a public school system and that provide free education from kindergarten through 12th grade to every young person in this state. That's a big deal. And the fact is that that state money makes a difference in how things happen. Charter schools also, I just want to make sure everybody has it in their heads. Charter schools are also publicly funded. The other thing is because the Constitution requires the state's leaders to use taxpayer money for schools, state leaders also get to decide a lot about how that money gets to schools. So there is a golden rule, and that's that those who have the money make the rules. As I said, the state has the money. That means they do make rules about a lot of things that happen in your schools. The subjects that your school has to teach, the qualifications of the teachers that are there, and a lot of the other employees as well. Everything down to the amount of time that school is supposed to be open, although we know this pandemic year has changed some of this, right down to the minutes is actually in California law, along with how districts report to their communities. And the fact is that local schools and districts live within those parameters, but then they make a whole lot of the decisions within that. When I think about how schools are organized in California, I like this map because it really looks like a jigsaw puzzle. And the fact is, every state in the state of California has a local school district that's in charge of providing education so that every student, whether you live up in the northeast corner or down in San Diego, has a place in the public schools. Further, every school in the traditional system, every school is part of a school district, and districts are in charge of deciding how to spend the money that comes from the state, but they're, as fiscal agents, they're responsible for making sure that that's done well. Charter schools are a little different. And if you imagine them being little dots throughout this map instead of puzzle pieces, they can get their funds from the district or from the state. They don't have attendance boundaries per se, so they don't have an obligation to serve a student at a given address. They're also local education agencies, and you'll notice they're in orange that there's an acronym, LEA. The fact is that's the first note you need to take, and if you're going to get involved actively in schools, you need to learn a few of these acronyms because you'll hear them all the time. So LEA is the first one on our list. And what an LEA is not either a school district or a charter school or even a county office of education. And so a lot of times people in the education world, and especially at the state, are going to use that acronym instead of saying school districts, charter schools, and county offices of education. So write it down. Now, here's our first poll question. Seems pretty simple. And I hope you'll take a couple minutes, and I'll see when we get the results where you go to school. And if you'll take a second to fill that out, that would be great. So we have most of the people, most of you are actually not at charter schools, although 16% are. About 10% of students in California are in charter schools. You almost all know the name of your school district. Good on you. And we have a combination of students in unified districts, remember, kindergarten to 12th grade, a few in grades 7 to 12, and a larger proportion in grades 9 to 12. So the fact is, let me get back in present mode. I'm sorry. There we go. Is that better? The fact is that California has a lot of school districts, 949 in all. And you'll see that they come in all different shapes and sizes. We have 346 unified districts and 525 elementary, which means no high school students. Most of those are kindergarten through 8th grade, but a few of them don't have 7th and 8th. So the configurations get pretty sloppy after a while. And the fact is that you can't really count on a school district to look a certain way in this state. 1,300 charter schools seems like a lot, but remember, they're individual schools. California has over 10,000 schools altogether. 58 county offices of education, and there are 30 special districts that do all kinds of different things. So, where do California students actually go to school? Turns out that a large proportion, 45%, of districts are really small, fewer than 1,000 students. And I would wager that for many of you, your high school has more students than that. And these are school districts. A lot of the small districts are elementary districts. On the other hand, 3 out of every 10 districts, or every 10 students, attend school in one of the 25 largest districts in the state. So there's a real difference in your school experiences. Let's look a little bit too at who attends public schools in California. There are 6.2 million students in our public schools. You can see that over half are Latinx, and really about a quarter are registered themselves by ethnicity as white. So ask yourself, maybe take a note or two here. Is your school similar to the breakdown of ethnicity in the state as a whole? Is it dramatically different or just a little different? Understanding how your school looks in comparison to all schools in the state is an important part of thinking through how your school is going to fit into the kinds of rules that the state makes and the kind of challenges. There's another thing. A lot of students in California face some extra challenges. 6 out of 10 are officially, it's called socioeconomically disadvantaged. But by and large, what that means is that their families are considered to be low income. Almost 20% are English learners. These groups of students on this list have extra challenges, or they're also called high needs students. They're really important to how schools are funded, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. So here's the takeaway. There is no typical school district. Schools are actually more alike than school districts. Further, the typical student in California is neither white nor middle class. And that drives a lot of how we think about schools and how they operate and how we ought to be thinking about their success or lack of success. So, on to question number 2. How are schools funded? This is my favorite subject, maybe. So, public school funding comes from 5 different sources, and here they are. See them on the screen. Take a minute. Just guess which source contributes the most money to your local school district and to the state as a whole. We're going to talk about the state as a whole first, but just jot down which one you think it might be. And then we will see whether or not you're right. Okay, here we go. Oh, look at that big orange block. Did you say state funds? Local property taxes are pretty important too. Federal money, even though we hear so much about the federal government and its impact on the schools, the fact is federal money is only about 8%. So it's really a pretty small portion, but they have some rules that we have to follow in California if we want that money. And finally, the lottery. There's a myth in California that the lottery provided this huge amount of money for schools. Well, there it is. It hasn't been over 1% ever. And there are also some restraints on how schools can even use those funds. So, how does the state decide every year how big that pie is going to be? The fact is that the state controls these 2 big portions of local property taxes and state funds. And the decision about how much goes to K-12 education is written into state law. It's called the Proposition 98 Guarantee, or the Prop 98 Guarantee. And that's another term. If you're interested in school funding, you're going to hear about the Prop 98 Guarantee. And what you have to know is that it is a combination of local property taxes and the state general fund. It doesn't include these other sources. And I didn't talk very much about this other local slice here. The other local slice is the revenue that your school district can generate through things like parcel taxes, interest income. Sometimes school districts get lease income because they have excess property. They're trying to figure out every way they can to raise their revenues. Donations also fit into that local, other local category. But when the state calculates the Prop 98 guarantee, these slices are not included. It is just that orange and yellow area. And frankly, it's adjusted every year. It's supposed to be based on prior year funding. There are some formulas. If you really want to learn more about the details of Prop 98, I'd be happy to do that, but we'll need another hour. So we won't go there now. But what you need to know is that it is a starting point for an annual debate in our legislature and with the governor about how much funding schools are going to get. And that's going on right this minute. The budget has to be approved by the end of June. And again, these 2 slices provide about 80% of all the money that K-12 schools get. So then the state uses LCFF, write it down, to decide how much each district gets. LCFF stands for the Local Control Funding Formula, and I'll explain it a little more later. But basically, a district gets an LCFF base grant depending on how many students they have. So it's a per pupil amount. It varies a little bit depending on grade level. So you can see that high schools actually get the most money per student according to the LCFF formula. And this is, if I have 1,000 students in my school district, I get 1,000 times that amount. Then we add something else. And this is really the state's nod to those higher need students. And it's a very important part of the funding and understanding how districts make decisions. And what happens here is that, say my school has 30% of its students who are either English language learners or low income. Those students, there's an extra funding in the elementary case here of $1,540 per student for that group of students. But if my school district has more than 55% of students that are considered high need, then it's called a concentration grant. And say I have 50 students who over that 55% threshold, I have 50 more students than 55%. Sorry to throw all these numbers at you. I would get $3,800 more per student. So there's a very heavy emphasis here in providing extra funds to those schools and districts that really have the highest needs and the most high need students. So some of the money that goes to schools isn't in that LCFF formula. And what that is really more, it's special funds that have to be used for a special purpose. And the technical term is earmarked. So some of the federal money, most of the federal money actually is earmarked. And there's also some state money that helps pay for things like special education, school nutrition, free and reduced price meals is a big piece of both federal and state earmarked funding. And after school and summer programs are another example of it. There are others, but these are the main ones. Then in addition, in California, state funds support some other areas. They support, for example, bus transportation, teacher training, the cost for administering the state tests, that all comes out of state money. And finally, the other thing you need to understand, and this comes up a lot when you're talking to school districts and say they're running a bond election, for example, facility construction is financed outside of the entire system that I've been talking about up to now. And if you're interested in that particular piece, that's the first thing you need to know about that. Okay, so here's a screen you should take a shot of. This is my elevator speech, as they call it, when someone says, how are schools funded in California? All right, here we go. State leaders decide how much K-12 education gets every year. Federal dollars contributed a small amount, and local districts have a small ability to raise revenues on their own. The state allocates funds to schools then based mostly on the local control funding formula, although, as I said, there are some earmarks for other purposes. Then districts decide how to spend those funds. And they do that operating within state rules and local union contracts. Some districts give their individual schools discretion over a substantial part of their budget, but frankly, most don't. The school district makes most of these decisions. So, how do schools spend the money they get? What do we see in expenditure data that tells us a little bit about the decisions that California schools as a whole are making? As I said, districts control their state budgets, but it's a sort of. As fiscal agents, they are legally responsible to balance their budgets. They are not supposed to spend more than they take in, and to figure out how to use those limited revenue raising abilities they have to maybe supplement a little. They do decide how funds are spent, But the kind of constraints that come in employee contracts around class size and work hours affect that. And in addition, they are required to use, remember though, on the LCFF funding in those blue bars, they're required to use that extra funding they get for high need students to support high need students. It's a concept. And so those kinds of constraints really do help drive the decision making about how schools spend their money. And finally, local districts govern how local schools operate up to a point. They have to consult with stakeholder groups. They have to have an elected school board. They have to use state measures that for reporting how they spend their money, in addition to some aspects of student outcomes. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Reminder, charter schools operate like school districts. Think about when you look around your classroom and your school. Districts have to budget for every single thing that the school provides. So, think about your own school. Here are some of the kinds of decisions that get made that really show up in the classroom experiences you have. Who are the students who attend your school? What are the grade levels? How many? Where do they come from? Who teaches? What subjects are taught? How is the school day arranged and the schedule coordinated? How many students are in each class? And is that different for AP Physics than it is for PE? What technology is available? That's become a really important question in this last year, certainly. And when you get back in the buildings, you can look around. Hopefully, most of you have been back a little bit. What are the buildings like? Is there lots of space? Do you have a library? Do you have a theater? What does your school look like? And does your school have counselors? Nurses? What kind of extracurricular activities? Is there a police force at your school? How do you get to school? And what hours is the school building open, both for regular instruction and afterwards? So look at all of these things. Who influences these decisions, and how do they influence the decisions that get made? I hope you'll be jotting down a few notes and come back and think about this, because it's really at the center of how you can get engaged and what you'll find interesting in getting engaged with how schools operate. So here's our next poll question. Hopefully it'll come up and hopefully my screen won't go dead. There we are. So there's a whole lot that makes for a good school, successful high school. What I'd love for you to do is just pick 2 things from this list that you think are the most important. And we'll see if you agree. All right. Interesting. Hopefully this wasn't just a factor of what was at the top of the list. Quality teachers is right up there. That says a lot. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what that can mean. Good support systems for students. All students feeling safe and cared about. Those are your top 3 choices. But the next one, student success after graduation, I would agree is really important. And it's the kind of thing that's not so easy to measure. But the state's working on that. Hopefully at some point you'll learn a little bit more about what's happening with the data system, because California has not had very much access to being able to answer that question about student success after graduation, but it's getting better. Thank you all for taking a minute with that. Think about your answers. We go on. So the fact is, the reason I want you to think about your answer is because your opinions really do matter. Students by law have to have a voice in district decisions. And the way that happens is through the LCAP. Another acronym, Local Control Accountability Plan. The idea of the Local Control Accountability Plan is to really lay out how school districts are going to spend the funding they get from LCFF. Remember that one? Local control funding formula. And this is all about communities coming together to decide a whole lot of stuff about how those funds get spent. The idea, though, of the LCAP itself, the plan, is that the school district provides to the public a description of its goals, its actions, what it's going to provide in the way of services, and how much money it's going to spend to do those services. It's supposed to reflect community input. It's supposed to address local needs. School districts really need to be embedded in and part of their communities. Because if you think about that jigsaw puzzle of California, we're a huge state. And what works well in Redding may not be so good in Riverside. The important thing here is that the decisions that get made support positive student outcomes. The district links the goals it describes and what it's going to do to what they hope happens for students. And it's intended to be a 3-year roadmap or a strategic plan, really, for a school district. And districts right this minute are in the process of finalizing their LCAPs, which will guide their decision-making and their expenditures for the next 3 school years. The process itself is really about planning for continuous improvement. Nobody's perfect, right? Plus, your goals change. But the idea is that schools look at, okay, how are we doing? How can we get better? Oh, we didn't do as well as we'd hoped. Should we change direction? And that's what that kind of planning for continuous improvement is about. If you get involved in the LCAP process in your school district, you're going to hear the words continuous improvement a lot. So the idea is that stakeholders have a say in that planning process, including students. And then there is accountability for the results that come after that. So the one thing you need to understand more than anything else about how money gets spent in schools is that the bulk of employee salaries, employee benefits, it's a people business. So I want to take you through a little example of how decisions get made that may look the same on the surface of a budget, but really aren't. So we're going to compare 2 school districts. They both spend $10 million a year on it. Day has 100 teachers. They pay them pretty well. District B has fewer teachers, or has more teachers, double the number of teachers, but half of the average compensation. What that means in a district that has 3,000 students is that District A will have 1 teacher for every 30 students, and District B will have 1 teacher for every 15 students. You can see the trade-off, right? So what does that look like for you as a student? Is it better for your school to be able to pay their teachers more and have fewer students? Or maybe not pay their teachers as much, maybe hire a lot of new young teachers, I don't know, but have more teachers so that the ratio is different. Okay, what needs to be improved at your school? This is really the important question. I'm going to talk really fast in case my internet flakes on me again. Boy, because we're really to the last major question. How well do California schools measure up? And when you think about that, there's 2 things: how much money's coming in and what kind of measurements, what kind of outcomes are being delivered by your school. So California historically has had below average funding compared to other states based on how much money the state provides per pupil. Look at that. And also when we adjust for the high cost of living in our state. The biggest impact of that has been that student-teacher ratio I talked about. And let me go back. The student-teacher ratio is the biggest impact, but it's not just teachers. It's school principals, district administrators. California is the worst in the country for the ratio of students to counselors, nurses, and librarians. So, other ways to think about this. Student outcomes. The state provides a lot of pressure and focus on the outcomes it can measure. Scores on English, math, and science tests, graduation rates. Attendance is important according to our accountability system because it's an evidence of how well schools engage and keep students interested in their education. Finally, successful course completions. What percentage of students are actually finishing the courses, for example, that enable them to be eligible for admission to UC and CSU? But there's a lot of things the state doesn't measure. These areas, character, communicator, conscientious learner, critical thinking, collaborator, being culturally competent, these things actually are outcomes from a school district in California, Novato actually, that are things that that school district has decided are really important besides just what the state is measuring. And keeping in mind that what the state measures is what they can collect the data on. Your local district can collect a lot of other things. And here are some examples. So, which of these outcomes do you see as vital to your personal future? Academics matter, but do any of these resonate for you, or something else that you think students need to get from their schooling? That's a question, actually. There's a rumor that the next speaker will address this even more. So it's an important thing for you to think about. And when you think about being involved in your school, it is important. Involvement means expressing your opinion. It means using your voice. And here's a secret. The adults who care about schooling really do want to hear your voices. They want to understand your experiences, how you see the system. Sometimes you don't get that at first, but I'm sure Zaid can talk a little bit about when he's been on the state board, for example. He talks and people listen because we understand that the student is really on the front line of what happens in our schools. It's important, though, that first you try to understand what is going on in the system. And that's what I do, is to just give you a little taste. Here are some chapters from Ed100 that go into more detail about some of the things I've been talking about. And you can also read all of Ed100, and then you will not, well, you won't know everything, but you'll have a pretty good grounding from which to become involved. So I am sorry about the technology, frustrating, but that's what I've got today.
Not a problem. Thank you so much, Mary, for that incredible presentation and for really teaching us a ton of things. Personally, I remember last year hearing your presentation, and it really helped pave the path for me by giving me all the definitions and things I needed to know for just being on the state board, being on my district's LCAP committee last year, and just a bunch of things. So thank you so much. We actually have a few questions to ask you in a Q&A. And so our very first question for you is that Arlen asks, I was wondering if student organizations do play a part in determining district budgets.
My first answer to that question is it depends on the district.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact is that there are lots of examples of places where that's true. Eastside Union High School District here in San Jose, where I live, actually works really hard to do a student poll, and students have led that poll. And there's a student organization that's key in that. There are officially, students are supposed to have a voice in the LCAP process. There are lots of places where it happens really well, and it's really exciting. If it's not happening in your district, learn about those things, and you will be learning about some of it as part of this conference, and step up and make your voice heard.
I definitely agree. Stepping up and kind of taking the initiative is one of the biggest steps, and probably the most difficult steps that you need to take to be able to really make an impact, I think. But another one of our students who are attending this conference, her name is Carla, and she asks, Why does the state of California care so much about tests instead of just basic skills?
You know, the question that resonates for me out of all of the student outcome issue is, what do students need to know and be able to do so that when they graduate from high school, they can pursue a future that is gratifying, that provides a living wage, that enables them to have an adult life that they want? And one of the things that's interesting is the definition of basic skills used to be reading, writing, and arithmetic. And frankly, those state tests are closer to just those basic skills, but at a level that hopefully prepares you for post-secondary education, whether that internships, community college, Harvard, or Yale in your case. But the fact is that the state uses those tests as a way to measure what schools are doing. They are a very small part of how we think about and ought to measure student success. It's a really important question. And again, it gets pretty deep, but it's an area I think I would love to have students push their school leaders to really get a better sense of how they're defining student success. I think that's a place where students could play an incredible role.
It's really interesting to hear your perspective on that. Avanti asks, who are the stakeholders in school districts besides students?
Well, your parents, your families, okay, that's like a whole thing. Teachers, other employees. So the employee groups really are an important part of that stakeholder engagement in local control. Administrators, but in addition, your community, include business leaders, church leaders. It depends on the dynamics in your community. But the stakeholders, frankly, are all those taxpayers that pay, that can be all those taxpayers that pay for public education. And so we have that. And hopefully also some of our government leaders and city leaders and county leaders. Everybody has a stake in your academic success. And when I say you, I'm talking about the students in California writ large. We all have a stake.
Awesome. Mary, we have a ton of questions still, but we have only time for just one more question. And that question is, how would you suggest getting involved in the LCAP at our school, at schools?
So for a lot of people, parents included, frankly, a good place to get started is actually at your school site. You understand it best. There is a budgeting process at your site. And talking to your school principal about that is a great way to get grounded and to begin to understand, but also expressing to your school principal the desire to be part of the district decision-making is a first step to getting there. And if they aren't responsive, you can go to the district, you can go to your local school board. Students have a right to be part of that process. But first seek, again, to understand, what is the process now? Is there a student advisory group? How does it operate? How does the district get that input now? And then be constructive in suggesting how to make it better. But I really suggest that starting with your school and understanding something of how your school is operating financially and its outcomes is a great place to start. And there are a ton of resources and links that will help give you some data so you begin to understand.